Welcome back to the Wealth Actually podcast. I'm Fraser Rice. Jared Dillian is here with us again. He has a new book out called Night Moves, which is a collection of short stories. I'm a gigantic fan, not only of the book and his fiction writing and all his other Renaissance man type stuff, but he's also got an impressive newsletter around investments, which is how a lot of people know him, called the Daily Dirt App. Jared, thanks for coming on again. I want to get into your book a little bit. But first, tell us a little bit about how you got into the writing habit and how you sort of transitioned into the next generation of your career.
Well, this is my fifth book, and I got to say that I've written 5 books across 5 different genres. So the first one was memoir, second one was a novel, the third one was an essay collection, fourth one was trade nonfiction, and this is short stories. I am, to my knowledge, the only person that has ever done this, written across 5 different genres for the first 5 books. I got a writing degree a little over a year ago. I graduated from Savannah College of Art and Design. I had an MFA in writing, but I've been writing, pretty much nonstop for the last 20 years. Going back to 2004 when I was at Lehman and I was writing the Bloomberg messages for, when I was trading ETFs. Before that, I had written some short stories in college that I thought were pretty good, and I go back and read them now, and they're pretty terrible. But that's really where I got started. When I read, I generally read short stories. I don't read novels. I subscribe to a few literary magazines. I read those. I get short story collections. I'm a really big fan of the art form because everything has to be in place. Every word has to be perfect. And yeah, I mean, this book has been the most fun book that I've written so far.
When you distinguish between writing short stories and a novel, and then the trade nonfiction, things like that, what's different about the short story form that you gravitate toward?
Well, first of all, let me say that the way I write short stories is not typically the way that people write short stories today. I'm kind of a throwback to the 90s. My stories are very plot heavy. There's a lot of focus on plot, whereas most short stories today, there is no focus on plot. It's really just very cerebral and what's inside people's heads, but there's no action. I start off every story with action, with somebody doing something, draws you into the story. So really, I finished this book and I took it to my agent and I said I would love to publish this collection of short stories. And he's like, look, there really isn't a market for what you're doing, but he's actually wrong. There's a big market for it. People love this book. It's gotten great reviews. I've heard from dozens of people that they can't put it down. So I think there is a thirst for that kind of fiction writing that you used to get, from the 90s and before, where you did have a focus on plot and character development.
When you start out with a story, do you know where you are going to end it? Do you have that in mind, or do you get going and it takes you in a certain path and then you end up where you want to be?
Most of the time when I write a story, I know the beginning and I know the end and I don't know what's in the middle. And that's kind of the fun part. I never have a story all planned out when I start writing it. It's really a process of discovery, So yeah, the last story, Beyond Love, I knew how it would end. I knew the beginning, and then it was just a matter of writing the stuff in the middle.
One of the things that I think is interesting is you're not afraid to go into the woman's characters in your stories and write from the woman's point of view. Do you find that challenging? How do you get into that mindset and operate in that world?
My wife says I do a really bad job at it. She says I suck at writing women. But interestingly enough, nobody else has said that. She's the only one who has said that. So I think I do a decent job at it. I don't know. I've done it a lot. Writing fiction is in a lot of ways kind of like method acting. in terms of you really have to get into the character, and it's using your imagination. So, obviously I am not a woman. Like, oh my God. Do you remember that movie As Good as It Gets with Jack Nicholson and Ellen Hunt?
That's right.
So Jack Nicholson plays this guy named Melvin Udall, who is a writer, and he has this fan that approaches him, and she says, "Oh my God, how do you write women so well?" And he says, "First I take a man, then I take away reason and accountability." So I don't do that. I don't do that. It's just a matter of imagination. I mean, there's two stories where the main character is female. One of them is Glowing, which is about a female economics PhD student at Utah. And the one right after that, which is called In Search of Truth, which is about a teenage runaway that gets sent to a cult. And there's female characters throughout the stories, but those are the two where you have the main character is female. I don't know. I think I do a pretty good job at it. I try.
For these stories, what does the research process look like? Or do you have a lot of this, coming from snippets of experience growing up and having your career and your pursuits outside of it?
Well, the interesting thing is that one thing that people have noted is that the stories are geographically diverse, and they take place all over the country. One of them in the high desert of Northern California, one of them in Utah, one of them in New Jersey. I mean, all over the place. And I'm very lucky in that I've gotten to live a bunch of different places. Like, I've experienced so much of the country, and these are American stories. They all take place in the US. And I have either visited or been to all of these places. And what's interesting is that I was just in New Orleans for the second time. For the first time I was there about 5 years ago, and I just went there a second time, and I was staying in the Marigny neighborhood, and I spent enough time there. I got a feel for it. I'm like, yeah, I could really write a story about this. So yeah, I mean, look, Alice Munro won the Nobel Prize for Literature, right? And all of her stories took place on the Canadian side of Lake Ontario. All of her stories. And not only that, in like the early 20th century. So, and it's amazing that I mean, like I said, she won a Nobel Prize. I love Alice Munro. I love reading her stuff. But holy shit, I get tired of reading about Canada. Like these little villages on the Canadian side of Lake Ontario. Like, I just get sick of reading about it all the time. Like, I like to have stories take place in different places.
It's like Stephen King in Maine.
Yeah.
You feel like you feel like you've lived there for
Yeah.
centuries if you get through all of his books. And I have sort of a weird relationship with Stephen King in the sense that I like a lot of the concepts that he writes about, but then how many times can you go back home to a cold part of the world, and what you're talking about makes a lot of sense. It's been said, and I forget the sage person who says that where you end a story kind of determines whether it's a comedy or a tragedy. Do you think about that with your writing at all, with the tone that you're trying to set and what you're trying to achieve?
Whether it's a comedy or a tragedy.
My guess is you probably understand that, but for instance, your short story about the lottery winner with the drinking problem and sort of the race to collect, depending on where you stop that story along the way, really could change the trajectory of what you think about what happens to that character. How do you sort of deal with the pacing or the end result on that?
Well, that story in particular has a terrible ending. It has a terrible ending, and I like the ending. I actually submitted that to a pretty unknown literary journal called Story Unlikely, and I got some feedback on it, and they didn't like the ending. And like I said, I don't like the ending. I like the last couple lines of the story where he says, "Well, I'm just going to go back and get a drink," right? Like, it's just an act of utter futility, and he gives up, and everybody wants that story to keep going. Like, did he Did he track down the people who found it? Did he eventually get to the lottery office? Like everybody wants to know. And like all the stories in collection, like I'm really comfortable not knowing the answer to that. People ask about 200 hours, like, did they get married? Did they live happily ever after or whatever? And I'm like, I don't know any more than you do, you know? But the point of the story is to leave you in a spot where you'll be thinking about the story for days afterwards, wondering what happened. You know what I mean? So I got a Kirkus review for the book. I paid like $600 for a Kirkus review, and the review wasn't very good. And the reviewer said that the stories had ambiguous endings. And I'm like, yes, like I'm not going to tie it up in a little bow and, say this is what happened. Like I like leaving the endings very open ended.
In the movie world, I can think of classics like The Graduate that have extremely ambiguous endings, and that's the charm of
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
What does a writing day look like for you? How do you structure your time? You've got different projects going on with your newsletters and then whatever else you're writing. How do you frame that out?
Well, I write my newsletter in the morning, typically from around 9 to 11 in the morning. I do miscellaneous admin crap and podcasts and stuff in the afternoon. I do my pleasure writing at night, like after dinner. It's funny, I kind of compartmentalize. I have this beautiful office and I have 4 screens, where I work. But I don't do my pleasure writing there. Like I do it on the couch in the living room with my laptop, with the TV on, usually watching the Yankees or Charlotte Hornets or something like that. And that's where I do my fun writing.
With the fun writing versus maybe the more structured, get it out there newsletter type of writing that you, let's call it, you quote unquote have to do. What's going on differently in your brain on that front that allows you to sort of muse and travel into different areas that let that happen?
Look, if I could write short stories all the time and make a living doing that, and I didn't have a mortgage and I like could just, I didn't have expenses and I could just write short stories. Maybe I'll do that when I retire. Like that's what I'll do. Economic realities sort of dictate that I have the newsletter and I have these other things that produce income and I have to do them. Not to say that I don't like them. I like writing the newsletter, but stuff like this is a lot more fun.
Do you ever get stuck, i.e., when you're going through one of your stories and you're writing it, and you may kind of know where you want to get to, but you're having trouble getting there? What happens in that case, and how do you sort of get away from the iceberg?
I generally don't get stuck. If I get stuck on anything, it's the beginning. The beginning of a story is so important, right? And like I said, I like to start my stories with some kind of action, like the beginning of Night Moves, where the DJ producer gets the speakers in the mail and he brings the speakers inside and sets them up. Just some kind of action to get the story started. So typically with a story, I'll write 1,000 words, 1,200 words, and I put it away. And then I come back the next day and I open it up and I'm like, please don't let this suck. Please don't let this suck. And I read over it and I'm like, okay, good. It doesn't suck. And then I can keep going.
To talk about the DJing for a second, that's one of your other pursuits is talented DJ and able to get crowds up and going. And you've traveled around the country doing some of that. Is there any crossover into that world that you see that sort of shows up in your writing at all, aside from maybe the subject matter of the DJ story?
Well, the only thing I would say is that a DJ, once you get past the mechanics of it, like actually using the equipment and mixing the tracks and stuff like that, like once you get past the mechanics of it, DJing is really all about curation. It's about curating a specific musical style, right? And a short story collection is actually pretty different, pretty similar. The stories are in order for a reason. Like it was funny, my mom like picked up the book and started reading from the middle. And I was like, no, don't do that. Like, don't read it from the middle. You have to read it from the beginning. Like they're that way for a reason, but whatever. So, but yes, like the sequence of the stories is there for a reason.
When you're doing your outside reading, You talk about Alice Munro and others. What do you gravitate toward? Do you like mysteries? Do you like the short story sort of O. Henry world, or things like that? Or do you gravitate towards something different?
I just like literary fiction. I don't really read genre fiction. I don't read fantasy. I don't read horror. I don't read mysteries. I don't read detective stories. I don't read romance. I don't read any of that stuff. Just plain vanilla literary fiction. And I got to tell you that most of the stuff that's out there these days is pretty terrible. I read it anyway, just to kind of get a sense of what people are writing and what's in demand and stuff like that. But I don't like a lot of what's being written nowadays, and nobody else does either. Sales of literary fiction are down 50% in the last 10 years. Writers are not writing for readers, writers are writing for other writers. If you look at all these literary magazines, they're not being read by pleasure readers. They're being read by writers who aspire to be in these literary magazines. So it's writers writing for other writers, and it's all crap, So I'm not writing for other writers. I'm writing for readers.
That sounds like a horrible silo and sort of self-fulfilling prophecy where you're trying to, one up other people,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
turns into a vocabulary exercise or something like that. Is there anything else, maybe how people digest these types of works? One of the things that I really liked, and I made a point of, we delayed this so that I could get the paperback. It took me back. I read a lot of things on Kindle now, and I noticed myself that when I go through sort of digital books like that, I'm much quicker. I don't retain it very well. With fiction, I'm extremely impatient. Whereas with a paperback, part of that is the short story component of your format, but having the pages in your hands and hunkering down and really sitting and absorbing it, I found that to be pretty nourishing. Is there something that we're missing by getting away from the paperback or the hardcover?
Well, the interesting thing is that my first book, Street Freak, came out in 2011, and that was right about the time that the Kindle became popular. And the first print run of Street Freak was 13,000 copies. Okay. Interestingly enough, in the first year, they only sold about 3,500 actual hardcovers. But people went bananas on the Kindle. Like many more people bought the Kindle version because back then people were like, "Oh my god, I love the Kindle. This is new. I want to read a bunch of books on Kindle." So I sold a lot of Kindle copies. So back then, I would say paperback and Kindle were about 50-50. And now people have gone back to the paperbacks, and sales of physical books over ebooks is about 80-20. Really, only 20% of it is ebooks. Most people read the physical book nowadays, which I think is a good thing.
Interesting. I'm not sure what I would have guessed. I would have probably thought 50-50, or maybe people continuing to move toward the electronic, if for no other reason, space or something like that. But I like hearing that fact. You've got Night Moves out there. You've got the newsletter, which keeps you busy on a day-to-day basis. What are you thinking about in the future on that? Or are you just sort of saying, okay, writing a book is hard. I need a break. I want to see this thing through and, make sure I market it correctly. But is there something nagging at you that you want to dig into and write about going forward on that fun stuff?
I'm in the process of a bunch of different stuff right now. So my sixth book is going to be another essay collection. It's going to be called Rule 62: Meditations on Success and Spirituality. And that's coming out in the summer of 25. I have a book contract with Harriman House for another financial book called The Awesome Portfolio. That's going to be coming out in 26. I'm going to start around Christmas break. I'm going to be writing that into the spring. Hopefully, I'll get it done by like March or April. And then after that, what I'm really looking forward to is a novel. I have a great idea for a novel. I've written a little bit of it. It is, I think it's actually, speaking of genre fiction, it's dystopian fiction. I think it could be like the next Hunger Games. It has great film potential. I'm really excited about that book. And if everything goes according to plan, that will come out in 2027. So
Wow, to have the projects laid out like that, it sounds daunting to me. having published one book and done some other stuff and things like that, it's hard work. So I enjoy hearing you're able to get through all of that and have it set up.
Yeah, I mean, actually, writing the book is the easy part and the fun part. Like, editing is very time consuming. Editing, proofreading, cover design, all that stuff. And marketing a book, like, I didn't really put a lot of effort into marketing Night Moves. It's very hard to market a short story collection. I'm talking to you and I'm doing a handful of other podcasts, but nothing really big. When No Worries came out, I must have done like 75 podcasts, and it's exhausting, and you're saying the same thing on every podcast, and it's just, I don't want to say it's tedious, but it's kind of tedious. um Marketing a book is not a lot of fun, like scrambling to get on TV and radio and all this other, it's really, nonfiction is really tough because you just have to do all this marketing work. I don't really enjoy it. So
On the business side of things, you have an agent, is that right?
yes, I do have an agent. Yeah.
How do they know what to do with you? You write across formats, you write within separate formats, different things. Has that been a challenge to get them to sort of present you to the right publishers, or is that? I mean, that's really what I think an agent should be able to do. But sometimes diversity can be an issue in terms of talent.
An agent is somebody who is steeped in the book world and knows what kinds of things sell, right? So, with Night Moves, I came to my agent with this manuscript, and he read it and he said, this isn't going to sell, and I'm like, okay, I'm like, that's horseshit, all right, and it is. So basically, the average short story collection sells about 500 copies. Night Moves has sold over 2,100 copies, right? Like, that is, I mean, to me, that is proof that the book, if it was traditionally published, could have been a big success. I believe that it could have been. And, my essay collection, Those Bastards, that sold 5,000 copies, did extremely well. That could have been a big success. So, with the novel, I talked to my agent and I told him basically the basis for the plot and what the book is about. And I said, "Do you think you can sell this?" And he says, "Yes, if it's executed well, if it's well done, then we should be able to sell this." I'm like, "Okay, so let's work on this together." So, I would like the publishing industry to take a risk on books like Night Moves, a book that has a masculine voice, is literary, but is not this fart smelling, no plot crap that people publish nowadays. Like, I don't really think the publishing industry has a real sense of what people want. Like, people just ache for a book like Night Moves. They absolutely do. When I published this, I heard from a bunch of people, they're like, "I don't read short stories." I'm like, "Yeah, you don't read short stories because the short stories are crap nowadays, right? Like, this is not crap. You're going to like this."
It's a format that I think is, been swept under the rug, or it just isn't very popular, and that's unfortunate because I would think short stories, well executed, as you say, would have a nice home. It sort of weds well with what I think is sort of an attention deficit society right now, and if people can pick off uh, some good stories in a bite-sized form, I would think that it'd be right there.
Yep. Yep.
So we're going to wind down here in a second. With the investment newsletter, as it goes, you have sort of your habit to get that out on a weekly basis, et cetera. Do you see similarities with what happens there with the quote unquote fun writing on the other side? Does it cross over at all? Sort of like similar to the question around the DJing. When you're looking for creativity or trying to get through, a tough part in getting your stories written, do you find something in that experience that helps inform other things?
I mean, the one thing about the Daily Dirt Nap, my newsletter, is that it is creative writing, right? May not seem like it, but it is. And I think that when I first started publishing it in 2008, I think it was an innovation, right? Because in 2008, investment literature at the time was not a lot of fun to read, right? It really had no soul, it had no personality, there was no humor. And that's why I think the Daily Dirt Nap was an innovation, like bringing creative writing to the investment world. And it's succeeded. It's been a huge success. And since then I have some imitators. I have some people who try to do the same thing and with some success. I enjoy all my writing. Getting the daily newsletter out is it's not tough, but I am looking forward to the day when I can retire from doing that. I've been doing it for 16 years. Because just having a daily deadline it's not stressful, but it's tough. Having a daily deadline is tough, and I travel a lot, and I'm publishing from the road, and I'm writing in hotels, and I'm writing on planes and stuff like that. And it would just be nice, to get away from that. So I guess I would say I'm probably not going to be doing the Daily Dirt Nap for another 16 years. I'm probably closer to the end than the beginning.
How has South Carolina affected your writing and moving down there?
Well, some of the stories took place in South Carolina. So Seaboard Street took place in South Carolina, and Creep did as well. I want to say one other one did with the Whitman School, took place in South Carolina. It's kind of a cool milieu. Like it's a cool place to write about. The culture here is so unique. The geography here is so unique. It was funny because when I've been living here for 14 years plus 14 and a half years, and it's part of who I am. I've been living in the Low Country since 2010, and I've seen a lot of changes. There's just been massive economic growth. There's been a lot of growing pains. There's been a lot of people from the north moving down here, which has changed the culture. So it's it's a really cool place to be.
Terrific. Jared, continued success. Encourage everybody to go out and get Night Moves. I'll have the Amazon link in the show notes. How else do we keep track of you?
Well, I mentioned the Daily Dirt Nap. So if you want to subscribe to that, go to dailydirtnap.com. I also have a Substack, which is called We're Gonna Get Those Bastards, which is free. I will never charge for that. And it's not a financial Substack. I just write about life and stuff. So I have about a little over 9,000 subscribers on that. So check that out as well.
Thanks for being on, and look forward to your future writing projects too.
All right. Thank you.